I'm the head of the European Parliament Liaison Office in Stockholm, in Sweden, and we're hosting this event today between Stockholm and Brussels and some other venues. So I'd just like to kick the event off by wishing you a warm welcome then to the Europe House in Stockholm and facilities that nowadays also include this platform on which we all meet. Normally, you would have seen a meeting room where we organize seminars, debates, training courses, classes, and meetings. And we try to contribute to a greater knowledge and perhaps also a greater engagement in European affairs in general and the work of the European Parliament and our members in particular. On Thursday this week, we will host an event on the Digital Services and Digital Market Act, also in English, if you care to follow that. On Friday, we speak about renewable energy in Swedish. And on Friday, we'll also meet the Swedish Minister of EU Affairs and 2 members of Parliament, together with school classes from all over Sweden. And all our events, as this one, you can watch on Facebook Live. But today, I'm delighted to learn more about genome editing and the farm-to-fork strategy. And I would also like to give a warm welcome to today's hosts of the discussion, Members of Parliament, Mrs. Jessica Polfjärd and Mr. Erik Bergkvist, as well as, of course, all you members of our network together in Europe, and of course, everybody else who is watching in today. And with this, I would like to give the floor to today's moderator, Mr. Chris Burns. Please, Mr. Burns, the floor is yours. Over
Marcus, thanks very much here at the European Parliament. This is one of these crucial issues right now because we're looking not only at how Europe is going to feed itself, but even the world. We're going to have to, by 2050, we need to find enough production, sustainable production without wrecking the planet for 10 billion people by 2050. How are we going to do that? And how are we going to further the farm-to-fork program that we have for sustainable farming, sustainable food systems? And genome editing is a part of that. And we want to see how that can be better defined so that researchers know what they can do as far as genome editing, what consists of GMO, genetically modified organisms, and what does not. And so we have 3 researchers who wrote a study about this, and they're going to be talking about this along with Jessica and Erik. And we also have with us someone from the Commission who is going to be speaking with us as well. That is Sirku Heinema. Welcome. You're with DG Santé, head of unit for GMO. You're leading a Commission study that is to be presented in April. So it's going to be interesting to get your angle on this. But I'd like to start, before that, I'd like to give you some tech sort of tips that we will entertain your Q&A, but it'd be good when you state a question to put it in the chat, put it with your name, and perhaps suggest some to one of the speakers you would like to aim that question at. Speakers, make sure you look in the camera. Speakers also turn your mics off if you're not talking. That's very important as well. And if you could tweet this, make sure it's not a tree crashing in the forest. We want to tweet this and cast it wider to #GenomeEditing. #GenomeEditing to express your opinion, or if you hear a good soundbite, that would be great to cast it wider. Now, let's begin with Jessica Polfjärd of the EPP group, and she is with the ENVI Committee, Environment, Public Health, and Food Safety. Jessica, why so much interest in this now?
Thank you, Chris. It's a good question, and I will answer it as good as I can in just a while. But firstly, I would like to thank Mr. Marcus Bonekamp and his staff here at Europahuset for the possibility to arrange and host this event. And both Erik Bergkvist and I are very surprised and happy, of course, over the amount of people that have showed interest for this event today. And it's a good question you asked, Chris. What and why is the interest for this topic? And I'm a bit surprised myself that so many chose to raise a hand and participate today, but I'm very happy. And I think this is an important issue, of course, for the future. And I'm also very happy that we can do this type of events, even though there's a pandemic and there's a crisis worldwide going on, but we can still focus on other topics. One of the reasons I think is, of course, the Nobel Prize in chemistry, which was awarded to the scientists behind the CRISPR-Cas9 technology. And I think that may have led to a great public interest that was a very good and positive for the sake, of course. And secondly, I would say that it is another political agenda. If we look at the priorities in this European Parliament, it is clear that we have a great interest to need to step up our work to be ambitious in the Green Deal matter. And then I would say it's the farm to fork strategy. Of course, it's important for many areas and sectors, and we know that it is about creating a more sustainable food system. It is an important part of that work, and it focuses on things that matter to all of us. How do we get the food in the future, and how do we do it safe, and is it enough for everybody, and is it safe for the planet as well? I would say that one of the answers, I know that no one can give the right answer, but I think one of the answers would be to embrace innovation, to be able to have a solution for the future. And I think that is where the genome editing comes into the picture. As well as we learned today, it has been an opportunity to transform our food system and to lead to more efficiency and less waste. So I think this discussion is very timely, and that we have the possibility to gather science and politics in this sense, and representatives from the Commission. Of course, we are very happy and proud that you could join us today. And I would just finish off by saying that I think that elected officials from the country who hands out the Nobel Prize have a special obligation to stand up for science. Looking forward to today's discussion, and very welcome. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jessica. Let me turn to Erik Bergkvist. Erik, can you see us, hear us?
Yes.
You are with ITRE, the Industry Research and Energy Committee. You're from the S&D party group. How do you encourage, now you being on that research side, how do you encourage research towards sustainable food systems and address GMO concerns? It's a balance, isn't it?
It is a balance, and right now my very firm opinion is that it's not a balanced view we have in the European Union when we put this genome editing together with GMO. And if we are to face the challenges that we have right now, and also the chance of the future to feed a growing population, then we have to change our views to get it in a way more balanced. I would also say it's a great pleasure for me to be able to host this event. I'm glad so many people are attending, and of course brings me extra joy being a researcher from the same university where Emmanuelle Charpentier did her breakthrough at the University of Umeå is of course really a joy for me.
You were a researcher before you became a member of Parliament.
Yeah, that's right, in economics.
And so I mean, to you, through the work that you did there, how important is it to have strongly, clearly defined regulations that will give you more clarity in the research you do?
It is, of course, important, but well, being an economist, we didn't really have any rules, so we could do pretty much what we wanted to.
Well, that's true.
But in this area, it's of course important to have clear rules. But yeah, when we look at the rules for this genome editing right now, EU has their rules and the rest of the world has other rules, which makes it impossible to actually do much research in the Union. But in the rest of the world, they can do research, they can develop both medicines, both new foods, both in agriculture and of course in livestock, which of course give us a huge disadvantage.
So we need more clearly defined rules on the EU level. Is that right? That's what we're
We
trying to figure out.
absolutely need more clearly defined rules, and we need more harmonized rules with the rest of the world.
Okay, why don't we? Thanks very much. Let's move to the Erik, the three people who wrote this study, and I want to turn to Professor Wendy Harwood of John Innes Center in the United Kingdom. Wendy, do you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you fine. Hopefully you can hear me.
Okay, great. Now, you're the first among the three to talk about this study. What does this study tell us about genome editing?
Well, I think it just tells us that there's still quite a bit of uncertainty. And I think it just highlighted some of the questions that still needed to be answered. But for me, it's all about the excitement around this. You know, I'm a scientist, and to be honest, to me, this is probably the most exciting technology development that I remember in my many years in science.
Why is that? Why are you so excited about it?
Well, I can give you some examples, and I will do, of the sort of possibilities of what this technology can do. But I think, you know, the opportunities are huge. And the technology is developing very quickly. And so those opportunities are just growing all the time. So that might
and Erica is sort of saying, well, the rest of the world is doing things that we can't. Is that, you know, is that where the excitement is? Is that if we can make these rules more clearly defined, there can be more innovation?
Yes, so I think it's all about the decision as to because genome editing is so varied, and because a lot of the changes that we can make with genome editing are exactly the same as changes that have been made using older techniques, and also changes that sometimes occur naturally. So I think, you know, that's one of the sort of the key things to think about. And other countries have made a decision that if that's the case, then perhaps they don't need to be regulated in a similar way to other technologies.
All right, you have a few slides to show us.
I do have a few slides. I'm just going to try and share my screen.
Okay.
And if you just
in mind that this study there is a link between the study and the study that the European Commission is going to come out with in April that we'll talk about a little bit later. But here is the study we're talking about now.
Okay, so I guess you can see my slides fine at the moment. So what I want to do is just to give you a few really brief examples of what genome editing could possibly contribute to the farm to fork strategy objectives. But before I do that, I just wanted to sort of set the scene, if you like, by just getting you to sort of think about the amazing range of food crops that we have at the moment. And my picture here are some of the brassica crops. And we have to consider that all of these crops, they will look completely different, but they were all derived from an original wild cabbage, which look nothing like any of these, to be honest. And breeders have been able to make these fantastic, you know, they've made these achievements because they've had access to genetic diversity. So that means access to mutations, small changes in the DNA that give the traits that the breeders are interested in. And it's the availability of new diversity that's so important in developing crops as we go forward, because we're going to face new challenges. We need new diversity to develop new crops to meet those challenges. And I guess my message is that genome editing is just one way of helping to develop that new diversity that we need to meet the farm to fork objectives.
That this is a concrete example. Broccoli was from genome editing, but that's not GMO. Right?
No, broccoli is not from genome editing. This is what I'm showing you here. These are just normal conventional plants. Okay.
Okay.
So we'll move on to the genome edited examples. But my point is that it's small changes in the DNA that have enabled us to breed the crops that we're all used to, non-GMO, non-genome edited, that we're all used to seeing in the supermarkets. So the examples I want to show are they're all just due, the traits that we're looking at, they're all just due to very small changes in the DNA, like a change in one letter in the DNA code. Okay, so my first example is in wheat. And this is really looking at the objective of ensuring sustainable food production. So it's the reduction of chemical pesticides. And this is a genome-edited mildew-resistant wheat. And you can see from my picture here on the right-hand side, we've got the wheat, which is resistant, and then we've got the control, which is covered in disease. And this was done using genome editing, targeting a particular gene called MLO. It's an interesting example because we've had mildew-resistant barley, spring barley genotypes in the EU for many years. And they were developed by introducing a similar MLO with a mutation from some Ethiopian land races. So it's a technology we're very familiar with, but we've never had it in wheat before until we were able to introduce it using genome editing. And this genome edited wheat is actually in advanced field trials being taken forward for commercialization. So a second wheat example, I like this one because it's very visual. This is looking at, if you like, increasing food security. And of course, yield is important because, as Chris has already said, we have to produce more food. We need to produce a lot more wheat to meet global demand. And this is an example of genome editing which has affected the grain size in wheat. So because wheat is such a complicated plant, we have to make mutations in 3 copies of the gene, and the gene here was one called GW2, but that doesn't really matter. But you'll see here the control, the normal wheat along the top, and then with the mutation in 1 copy, 2 copies, and then at the bottom in all 3 copies. And it led to a 20% increase in weight. So you can see the grains are bigger, they're a bit longer, they're plumper. And this is a genome edited technology, which is now, breeders have taken this material and they're testing it for introduction into breeding programs. So the third one, so here we're just looking at health, and I put this example in because this is the first gene edited food to be approved by the government in Japan. It's been very recently approved, and it's actually a tomato which contains higher levels of a particular amino acid, which we can call GABA, and it has 5 times the level. And this is a compound that's fairly well known for being effective in lowering blood pressure and reducing stress. So this has been very recently approved in Japan, and it's just an example again of a simple genome edit leading to this increase in this valuable compound. And it's one of, I could have picked many examples for where there might be nutritional benefits for using sort of gene editing. And just my final example is on reduction of food loss and waste. So, it's very sad that an awful lot of the fruit and vegetables that we produce are never actually eaten. They're wasted for various reasons. And genome editing can be used again in a number of ways, but the example here is to reduce browning. And this can be done in apples, potatoes, mushrooms. But in this potato example, if you look at this top row of this picture here, you'll see that after the potatoes are cut, after 24, 48 hours, they're very brown, really looking not very appetizing at all. But the genome edited ones have much less browning. And so therefore there would be a lot less waste. And this is an example of this particular potato is in field trials at the moment in Argentina. So those were my examples, just really briefly, in these sort of 4 different areas. And I guess I'd just like to say that these were all examples of very simple genome edits. Of course, there are far more sophisticated things that can now be done with genome editing as well. And some of those more sophisticated things would be more similar to GMOs, whereas these very simple edits are far more similar to mutations that would occur naturally. But another thing to say is that genome editing it has the power to really significantly speed up plant breeding. So you can end up with the trait you want using genome editing far quicker than you can using a lot of conventional breeding techniques. And that's really important when we need to move quickly. And because me as a researcher, the impact that this technology is having in research is really exciting. It's impacting so many different areas of research at the moment and allowing much faster progress. So I think that's enough from me on my slides.
Wendy, that's great. Thank you very much. So you're showing the advantages, the contribution of genome editing, and that some of these examples that you gave are not GMO, right? These are things that can be done that would actually normally be done in a natural situation. It's simply done, I guess, in an accelerated way, right?
Yes, that's right. And I guess that's what this discussion is all about. Should the things like the examples that I've shown you, which just contain a small mutation, are they GMOs or not? And that's an important question. Should
Yeah,
they be?
and with that small mutation we saw with the wheat, you could increase output by 60%.
Well, it was a 20% increase in grain size. So
Okay.
there are other things to consider there as well, but it's a way of certainly making bigger grains, which could lead into higher yields if used.
Higher yield. That's right. Okay, great. Let's come back to you. Don't go away. Let's talk to Pete Vandermeer, who's at Ghent University and Free University Brussels. Pete, are you with us, Pete? If we can switch over to Pete.
I am with you. Hi, Chris.
There you are. Okay, and I got to warn the audience that you're really in a hurry. You're working on something else right now, but it's great to have you with us. So if you can stay with us a little bit to discuss this, what are GMOs and why are they regulated?
I'll be happy to do so. Let me share my screen with you.
Okay.
So please confirm that you can see my screen.
There we go.
Very good.
And click on the slideshow. There we go.
And I just added to the first slide here just a bit of my history, because as you can see, I have been involved in this field since 1986, and I've seen many discussions come and go in biosafety regulations and GMO regulations. And this one on genome-edited organisms is the most persistent one. It started somewhere in the mid-2000s, and it is still going on. And given the recent discussions, developments, I think it's great that the two MEP hosts are organizing this webinar. So what I'll be doing with you is to give you, in 4 slides, a little bit of the history, because all it comes back to what has been discussed at the beginning. Then discuss with you why do we have a regulatory discussions on new breeding techniques in general and genome editing in particular. Say a few things about the GMO definition in the EU and the famous 2018 court ruling on mutagenesis. And these last 2 points are part of an article that we have produced on this and that has been referenced before. So to give you a little bit of the history, this whole debate started somewhere in the mid-70s, and a landmark was the Asilomar Conference, where they spoke about recombinant DNA after a year of a moratorium started by scientists, and they came to some very important conclusions. And the first one was that the technology of moving genes around is not inherently risky. That happens in nature. But the conclusion was that with this technique, these new techniques, and then they called it recombinant DNA, you can make novel genetic combinations. And with these novel genetic combinations, it's not always the case that you can rely on the existing systems such as variety registration for enough familiarity. And they refer to this as there are biological unknowns, or there are novel things in there. And that's why in that conference, it was concluded that the best way forward is to have a targeted approach in a case-by-case assessment, whether or not in these novel genetic combinations there are safety concerns. And what you see is as of the mid-70s, countries start to produce guidelines and regulations. And again, the definitions all focus on novel genetic combinations. Up to then, it was all about microorganisms in laboratories. And then there was the first transgenic plant developed here in Belgium. And that opened a whole new debate, because then it would not only be in laboratories with microorganisms, this would be with plants, and plants would go to greenhouses and be tested in the field and so forth. So that opened a whole new discussion about regulations. And the first ones to react to this were the United States. They produced a coordinated framework for regulation of biotechnology, quickly followed afterwards by the European Union with 2 directives on contained use and release into the environment on GMOs. This was followed by the establishment of the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety, which talks about transfer of living modified organisms. It's a bit of a different term, but it's roughly the same thing as GMOs. And again, you will find in the definition of those LMOs, you'll find a reference to novelty. Then why do we have a discussion on new breeding techniques and genome editing in particular? First of all, new breeding techniques are a very big collection of different techniques. But they have one thing in common, and that is they can result in changes that can also occur with conventional breeding, or that also happen in nature. And then, of course, the key question is are the resulting organisms GMOs? And this discussion started in the mid-2000s and is still going on in parts of the world. In most countries where they have discussed this, they came to a conclusion that some genome-edited organisms fall under the regulations, and whatever the term is they used. And others do not. And then in particular, if there are small minor changes that happen in nature, a few base pair changes, those would not be covered by the regulations. These discussions have been finalized in Americas, in North and South America, in Japan, Australia, and so forth. In the EU, we have discussed this since 2007, and many bodies were involved, including EFSA, the Joint Research Center, a working group on new breeding techniques, but we have not yet had a formal opinion on the interpretation of the GMO definition. And then there was a ruling in 2008 by the Court of Justice on mutagenesis, and that has followed by a lot of confusion and debate and claims that now the ruling means that all genome-edited organisms are GMOs, and others claim the opposite. Mm. And then, as what we saw in 2019, the European Council, or the Council of the European Union, asked for a study, the Commission to produce a study on the status of novel genomic techniques and the status under EU law. And that for me means that the Council too had no clear conclusion of whether or not the court ruling meant that all genome-edited organisms are GMOs or that none of them were. And they asked the Commission for a study on this. And the study is about, as it explicitly says, what is the status under EU law? And that means that you have to clearly analyze the GMO definition. And now I come back to the article that was mentioned in the beginning, which is published in the European Journal of, I see a typo here, of Risk Regulation. So what we've done with a number of colleagues, and they're all on the line on the call this today, lawyers and scientists alike, we have analyzed the GMO definition in the same way as the European Court of Justice analyzes law, and they look at the wording, the general scheme, and the spirit of the law. Now, Chris has asked me not to go into a deep discussion on the GMO definitions. Well, Chris, don't worry, I won't.
Okay.
But just as a reminder, that it's not a matter of just quickly looking at a text and thinking, oh, it's this or that. No, this is a very thorough process. So you look at the wording, the actual wording, and you look at Article 2 of the directive and Annex 1. If you look at the general scheme, as the court calls this, you look at the history and you look at the broader regulatory context. And in this case, that is, for example, the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety. And you look at what they call the spirit, and that is more about the function and the consequences. And we talk about the function of these regulations. They are to set up a system where the heart of the whole system is risk assessment. And then the question is, how can you do a risk assessment which is comparative on something that is not to be distinguished from other organisms? And the consequence is also an interesting way forward. You could ask yourself, what if I take with genome editing a gene from a potato plant and I place it back in the same chromosome on the same place in the same orientation? Then I have used a technique, but nothing has altered. So what we have done is we did in a very detailed way, we have looked at all of this and we've come to the conclusion that for an organism to be a GMO, the technique used and the novelty of the resulting genetic alteration must be considered. So the mere use of a technique does not by definition result in a GMO. It is about the novelty. And this comes back to what I said in the beginning, and that started in the 70s and has been the general line ever since. About genome editing, the mere use of genome editing does not by definition result in a GMO. If you look and analyze the definition, it depends, if you have used a technology, whether you've produced something that is of a certain level of novelty.
Right. So Pete, it means it depends. It depends on whether on the technique used and how different this genetic alteration is. Right. Who would decide that? I mean, should there be some kind of a board, an independent board that would decide, okay, that's a GMO, that's not a GMO?
Those would be for the regulators. Now, there's an interesting question what you raise here, because there are cases such as in Brazil and Argentina, where is the government looking at it. So if you've used genome editing in Argentina, for example, then you submit your dossier to the government, and the government will come to the conclusion whether or not you're produce something of such a small change that it is not a GMO under their regulations, or whether you've produced something that is so novel that it indeed is. So in some countries, it is the government deciding it. In other cases, it is for example, in the US, it is the applicant itself. You can decide, but you can ask the government voluntarily for an opinion. Yeah, but the first conclusion is that you need to understand that it is both the use of the technique and the resulting genetic alteration that need to be taken into account. Now I come to my last slide, because then there was the court ruling. And the question is, does the court ruling change all this? Did it send this whole discussion in a different direction? And our overall conclusion is it didn't, but let me briefly summarize this. So the court ruling was on request of a French court that asked a number of questions, but two of them were very important here. First, to ask whether organisms obtained by mutagenesis are GMOs. And the court simply confirmed yes, and that of course, because that is mentioned in the directive. Now the important thing here is, and that comes in the second one, because a number of genetically modified organisms or categories are exempted from the rules under the directive. And the thinking behind that is a simple one, that if you regulate on the basis of novelty, as we have been doing, and we don't regulate on the basis of risk, we regulate on the basis of novelty. And if your novelty has disappeared because you become familiar with it, and there's a long history of safe use, then you can exempt it. Now, this is in the European directive incorporated. That is also in recital 17. You find this in article 7.4 of the Cartagena protocol. So this is an overall approach of biosafety regulation. It regulates on the basis of novelty, and it exempts or can exempt on the basis of familiarity. So the European Court concluded, oh, I forgot to say yes here, but so there is an exemption, and the question from the French court was, does this exemption only apply to organisms obtained by conventional random mutagenesis? And the court concluded, yes, it only applies to that. Simply for the simple reason is that by the time the directive was adopted, and I was part of that whole process in the late 80s and in the late 90s again, we did not discuss genome editing because it didn't exist then. So there's something to say for the court's conclusion that indeed you can only exempt or consider to be exempted what was known at the time. Now we had the whole discussion. What does it actually mean? Does this mean now that all genome edited organisms are GMOs? And this is often based on this reference to the fact that organisms, as it is said in the court ruling, organisms obtained by directed mutagenesis are GMOs, and they're not exempted. But all of
right. So they, at the moment, they are identified as GMOs.
But be careful. Let me take the next step, because it all depends on what is mutagenesis. Yeah. And the unfortunate thing is that we, and I'm guilty here too, at the time in the 80s and 90s, we did not define what is mutagenesis. We thought everybody would understand what it was, nor has the court defined it, nor was it asked to do so. It doesn't mean that we know nothing about what a mutagenesis is, because what we do know about mutagenesis, as the court has confirmed, it results in a GMO. So this means that whatever we think is mutagenesis, the resulting organisms are only then GMOs if they comply with the definition Article 2 that I just discussed. Yeah, so the conclusion from it, and this is the last part, is that yes, mutagenesis results in GMOs, but it all depends on what do we mean by mutagenesis. And the only thing we know for certain about it is that the resulting organisms must comply with the Article 2 definition. So this means that the court ruling did not yet settle this whole question. And therefore, the 2019 Council request to the Commission is very, very welcome. And I very much look forward to the Commission coming with a very clear conclusion, interpretation of the Article 2 of the Directive on GMOs, and a clear direction as to which type of organisms fall under that direction, that definition, and which do not. And I'm delighted to have seen that people from the Commission are on the line. I do apologize, I can stay a bit for the discussion after this, immediately after this, but then I have to go over the very urgent other things. So
that's fine.
I'm back in your hands again.
Okay, well, Pete, what, I mean, just very briefly, what impact do you hope this study will have on this GMO debate and genome editing debate?
You're referring to the Commission study or the article?
Your study. What impact do you hope to have?
We hope to, first of all, to clarify that if a court ruling comes out and it's difficult to read, do not just read the press release about it and come with firm statements that mean this, that, or the other. Clearly
read on. Yeah.
Read it, carefully read it, and carefully analyze also the underlying definition of a GMO. So the overall message here is that the question is still unresolved as to which genome-edited organisms are GMOs in Europe and which are not. And the good thing is now with the Council request to the Commission is that the Commission can clarify this in their study. And I hope they will do this in quite some detail so that we don't have this resounding uncertainty. Because as a former regulator, is the worst thing you can have with regulations is that it is sustained uncertain. That is bad for everybody, including bad for biosafety.
Absolutely. Researchers don't like uncertainty. Businesses don't like uncertainty if they're going to be investing in something like this. Let's turn. Thank you very much, Pete. I hope you can let us know when you got to go. And if you got to go now.
Well, if I can have a few minutes if anyone has an urgent question, but I think
All right.
all the authors of this article are on the call here, so they may be able to answer later.
Yeah, I'm kind of running a little bit behind, so I'd like to shift over to Tomasz Zimny, the Institute of Law Studies, Polish Academy of Sciences. You're also in the Academy's Biotech Committee. Tomasz, are you there? Okay,
yes,
Tomasz, you okay? So you're got full screen with your presentation. So go ahead and give us your presentation as quickly as you can. We'll get to Q&A after that.
Okay, I'll try to be brief. The more so that to an extent I'll just reiterate some of the comments that MP Bergkvist and Professor Harwood already mentioned in the beginning. Because obviously the question of governance options is rather complex and as such impossible to deliver in such a brief presentation. So I would like just to mention certain issues that are at stake with the current governance that we have and show some possible ways forward that are being proposed currently. To an extent, as a result of this court ruling that Pete mentioned just a couple of minutes ago. I don't know why the slides are not changing. Okay, all right. So just a brief remark that people tend to equate governance with regulation. However, that's probably not a proper thing to do, because there is a lot more to governance than just regulation, and probably the most excuse me, the most important thing about the most important part of governance is providing stimuli for a certain governed technology or area of human activity to develop in the desired direction, and this is achieved not only through regulation but also through other means such as financing, and we have that covered to an extent, for example, through the Horizon program, through education. This we have also covered to an extent. There are thousands of biotechnology students graduating every year all around Europe, and some of them go into this field that we are discussing today. There needs to be a favorable legal environment in general, and this includes such issues as legal certainty, as a predictability of decisions of the authorities that make decisions in a certain field, also abilities to protect innovations in a certain field. And this, we also have it covered to an extent, especially the directive on the protection of biotechnological inventions is full of declarations, grandiose declarations as to how biotechnology is supposed to become a basis for this development of civilization and so on and so forth. So this, I only wanted to stress that there is a lot more to governance than just regulation. However,
Thomas, can you move quickly? Can you move quickly to the results of your study, because you are among those who wrote this study, and we need, that's what we're trying to get to before we go to our Q&A.
All right. However, what I was asked to present here is like, to an extent outside of this study, because of the fact that that it kind of is outside of the very strict scope of it. But all right, I'll be brief. I'll be brief.
Yes, thank you.
There's been a knee-jerk reaction from the research community to the judgment, because of the reasons that Pete mentioned already. That most of the people interpret the judgment as a tool through which all the gene-edited organisms are going to be regulated the way GMOs are currently regulated. And as with all the regulations, there is also always a balance that needs to be sought from a legal point of view between the protection of health and the environment on the one hand, and the protection of some fundamental freedoms, such as the freedom of arts and sciences, or the freedom the freedom to conduct a business, for example, on the other side. And this is, and any kind of regulation bears a cost. And most of the, many of the voices that are currently being raised in these discussions are based on an assumption that the current framework for the regulation of GMOs in the European Union, that it works properly, which is not the case, because there are many studies that show that the process is lengthy, that it's very costly, and its outcomes are uncertain. And they are uncertain because of two reasons. The first reason is that eventually the decision as to whether a product is going to be authorized for the market or not depends on a political vote in a standing committee. Even if there are favorable scientific opinions as to the safety of said product, there is a, well, possibility that the product will not be accepted. And when it comes to cultivation, there is also a means for the countries, there are also means for the member states to actually ban the cultivation of an authorized product, even if it was authorized, so its safety has been proven through all these throughout all these procedures. So, so if the current regulation framework were to be applied to gene editing products, they would face these same problems as problems as the so to say classical GMOs are currently facing. And this also involves international trade, problems with asynchronous authorization between different countries. Pete already mentioned it regarding solutions. So the researchers reacted to the judgment of the European Court of Justice by proposing several amendments to the current legislation, and most of them boil down to deregulation of groups of organisms based on their traits, their method of development, or the combination thereof. Some procedural changes are also being proposed, such as pre-market approval, in the sense that, well, the status of the plant, whether it is going to be regulated or not, should be determined before the works start on the certain plant and not after. There are also proposals of some expedited authorization. What does it mean? Well, the whole movement of the research community and all those proposals show that the community doesn't see the current regulatory framework as serving the purposes it is supposed to serve, in particular being an efficient tool of authorizing these plants. So all these current proposals for changing the regulation, they are aimed at essentially excluding certain groups of organisms from the regulation in order to avoid all the red tape and all the hassle and uncertainties that are connected with the application of the current regulation. And this brings me to some very general conclusions that in the current state of affairs, there is in order to have a technology used as a tool in a certain strategy, there needs to be a viable way to use this technology. And in the current state of affairs, if the gene-edited products are going to be treated as classical GMOs are, there is not going to be such a way. So whereas in every governance, there needs to be a balance between the protected values, right now this balance is very heavily shifted to the safety to an extent that actually the regulated products are essentially excluded from the market under the guise of providing safety to the consumers. And
so Tomasz, this points then, in conclusion, this points to a possible deregulation, right?
Well, that's what the research community proposes. I don't know where the political decisions are going to move, because the political decisions are often based not on risk assessment, but on social perceptions of risk. So many regulators look at what the general population thinks about a certain technology and base their decisions on what the population thinks about those technologies rather than on the actual scientific data. And I guess this is an issue that needs to be heavily addressed if any a new governance framework is going to be prepared in the future. So.
Okay, Tomasz, thank you so much. Don't go away. Pete, are you still with us?
Chris, actually, I am. I'm preparing a proposal for that has to be submitted at 5. I'm listening in.
Yeah.
So, but I will be actively raising questions. But I can.
Okay. All right, good. And I noticed that you're going to be back at the Parliament's STOA on the 15th April. Is that right? The Parliament's Science and Technology Options Assessment Committee webinar titled "The Challenges of Genetic Engineering for the 21st Century."
Correct.
Yeah. Okay, and perhaps that would be good to listen in on as well. I got a question to all the panelists. What would be required to change the Commission's interpretation? A new court case, a clarification by the Commission, and how realistic is this? You can put your camera back on, Pete. Okay, there you are.
Since you put me on the spot, but this will probably be the last one. Actually, I have not seen any formal interpretations of the Commission on what is and what is not a GMO. The Commission started convening these meetings in 2007. Has for many years, there is a report that came out of it. We're still waiting for this, and that's why I'm quite excited to know that the Commission will come with a report in April.
Right. Okay.
It will be their own interpretation, and then we can take it from there.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Okay. Well, let me before I entertain other questions, maybe that same question I can pitch to Sirku Heinema. Sirku, are you there?
I'm here, yeah, and I'm
okay, DG Santé, head of unit for GMO. You're leading the Commission's study to be presented in April. How does this study you just heard about, what's the link with what your study? Your study is a broader study, right?
Correct. So what we have heard here today from this other study, it's really going into the interpretation of what the Court of Justice has done as regards these new organisms, organisms derived from the new techniques. How would they fall under the GMO legislation, whether they fall under or not? Actually, it really is about the exemption, mutagenesis exemption. So are they exempted or not if they are also derived from mutagenesis, so from the new techniques, which also lead to mutagenesis. And this was actually the basis of the Council's request to the Commission, this court ruling. And for the Council, the court brought clarity. So now there's a little bit the discussion here today that, oh, there's still unclarity. The Council didn't say that there's unclarity legally. They said that there are implications, there are consequences from this court ruling. And these consequences, they impact the member states, competent authorities, they impact the union industry, especially the plant breeders, also the research and other sectors. So the Council asked the Commission, please, Commission, look at this from the broader perspective. Look, there's the status, there's the legal status, but there are other things around this. And this is in fact what the Commission is doing. So if you give me 2 seconds, I can give you a little bit more what we are trying to do with this study.
Okay, briefly though, yeah. But please do.
Just to say that we are really going beyond the legal status. We are looking at what benefits these techniques could bring, but also what concerns there are, because there's a lot of concerns out there, and this we should not be blind about that. We should not forget those. So in our study, we have consulted EU-level stakeholders. So we are basing what we write very much on what is given to us as an information from the relevant stakeholders. But we have also consulted European Food Safety Authority for the risk assessment part, and we have also information from Joint Research Center where we are with these techniques, because I think all the scientists that are listening today, they agree with me that this development didn't stop in CRISPR-Cas that got the Nobel Prize. It's ongoing every day. So these techniques are further developing. So it's very exciting, as Wendy said earlier today. So this
Okay, so if you could answer that question to the panelists that I just said to Pete, is that, will it take a new court case, or will this study that you come forth with in April, will that offer the clarification that we need?
So first I want to say that it's the court that decides how the legislation is read. So it was a preliminary ruling. It's not for the Commission then to start reinterpreting what the court has said. So we have now the landmark ruling, which is what we implement. So what I hope is that the study will do then to these people who still have maybe doubts or are not so sure. I hope that the study, the way we explain the court ruling in the study and the current legislation, how it applies, I hope this will help in clearing the situation.
Jessica Polfjärd, are you there with us? Jessica?
I'm here.
Yeah, just let us know what you think about this study. And there's a question coming in here saying, I hear we need to clarify regulations. Do you mean make them less strict? And that was kind of my question earlier, is, does this point to deregulation?
I think that the most important when you do regulation is that have some substance, and that it's easy to understand and to be transparent. And therefore I think that it is hard. If it's hard to explain and understand, it's not a valuable legislation. And therefore I think it's very important that we can have this conversation, and it's also a discussion. Every party group would say that they trust science, and that we rely upon science and we make decisions upon science. But even though we will end up in different solutions and in different point of views. So I think that is crucial and very important to organize an event like this today, to just gather science from different areas. And I think it's a responsibility you have as a legislator as well, to listen to science.
Does this study, how much does this study help what you're doing in the Parliament?
I mean, we have we trust a lot of different studies, of course, and it will help us to make a decision in the future. The more science we have, the more possibilities we have to it will help us further.
Erik Bergkvist, can he move in too? Can we ask Erik? Yeah. Erik, same question to you, and also we have somebody asking, even if the rules cannot be harmonized, would at least harmonization of safety assessment principles by the EU and overseas help?
That would help a bit, but I think it's absolutely necessary that we clarify some things, that GMO and genetic design, genetic scissors is not set to be the same. So it has to be possible in the European Union to do significant research without too much bureaucratic overload in this area, and also, of course, to use the fruits of this research in the European agriculture sector.
So how much does this study help you in what you're trying to accomplish in the Parliament?
Well, I hope it will help me a lot. I don't really know what will be in it, but from what I hear in this seminar and also in other, through the grapevine, it's promising. So much I can say and hope.
Another question from someone is, what happens if the EU continues to treat genome editing as GMO? What happens?
Well, I would like to use a strong word, but I think it's appropriate. It would be a disaster because our researchers wouldn't be able to develop both their own skills and develop these crops and also an animal production. And the European agriculture sector will lose in competition, meaning that the consequence would be from what the team for today, the fork to farm, it would be a strategy, but it wouldn't be worth the paper it's written on because we would be losing out so much in competition.
It would be a disaster. That's worth a hashtag genome editing for anyone wishing to do that. Let me shift over to Wendy Harwood over at the UK, John Innes Centre, United Kingdom. Wendy, are you still with us?
Yes, I'm here, Chris.
Now, I want to add something here too. Brexit, and there is, let me see here, that the British government is reviewing on its side how it's treating this, and they cited your center. What do you see the prospects here that Britain might loosen things up and deregulate faster than the EU, which would put the EU at a disadvantage, wouldn't it?
Yeah, you're right. So here in the UK, so DEFRA, that's our Department for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, have recently announced a consultation on genome editing in particular, on these new, well, it's a consultation on genetic technologies, which is really focused on genome editing and how it should be treated in the future. So this is a public consultation and with a number of questions. And actually the first question is, should these types of organisms where they've just got changes that could have been produced through traditional breeding, should they still be regulated in the same way as GMOs? So, this consultation is just started. But I think it's a really good opportunity to collect views from many different sources, and then I guess decisions will be made.
Wouldn't this raise alarms about level playing field between the EU and Britain in food production?
I think these are some of the questions that are being looked at, and I think it's possible. We can certainly see advantages from the science in that perhaps it would allow us to proceed more rapidly with field trials to really push some of these technologies forward more quickly. But then other areas which I'm certainly not an expert in terms of trade, you can imagine that there would be some serious issues to deal with there. So I think it's going to be advantages and disadvantages maybe.
Okay, a question from another panelist. To all the panelists, a question from somebody watching to the panelists. How does the EU rules differ from those elsewhere? What does that mean for the playing field, as we've just been talking about? When do you want to answer that before we go to somebody else?
Yeah, I could take that just quickly. So in many other countries, the rules differ, but I think you could sum them up that a number of different countries have made the decision that if the plant or animal that's been modified, if it doesn't contain any foreign DNA, then it's not regulated in the same way as a GMO. So there's a less strict regulation. But the other thing that comes up again and again in the regulations in other countries is that all these things are looked at on a case-by-case basis. So there is definitely a move to looking at what change has actually been made, what's the trait that's been changed, rather than worrying so much about the method that's been used to get there.
Okay, Tomasz, are you with us there?
Yes. I'd like just to add to this to what
yes, please.
Saying. Well, those countries that decided to deregulate certain products of gene editing techniques, they are not just some countries. Those are our major trading partners. Those are countries from which we import huge amounts of agricultural products. And this difference in regulation can cause huge practical problems. Imagine that there is a product which is not regulated in one country, but it is treated as unauthorized GMO in the EU. Then the phytosanitary authorities are obliged to prevent the influx of this product into the European Union market. It cannot be sold legally here. However, there is no practical way or there are very limited means in order to detect it and to prove that this product is actually regulated in the EU and then to remove it from the market. This is a huge difference, and the potential deregulation in the UK is going to cause such problems as well.
Okay, so the argument would be we need to deregulate to stay competitive, but how much do you deregulate? And the critics of GMO would say this is just a race to the bottom. What do you think?
Well, I wouldn't say we need to deregulate to stay competitive, but we need to introduce a framework that's practically applicable. That's yes. Not what we wish for, it's what we need to do if we want to simply be able to trade properly. So it's a different situation. We find ourselves in an objective situation where our major trade partners decided to deregulate certain products. And
Chris, this is Pete. Can I join in here?
Oh, Pete, you're still with us. Great. Yeah, please jump in.
I'm frantically writing a document, but I'm listening with one ear. I think for this debate, we need to separate a number of things. First of all, you have to be very clear whether you're talking about whether something is regulated at the moment or whether you think it should or should not be regulated in the future. Those are very different discussions.
Okay.
Secondly, the whole discussion, because I've heard several times, and you mentioned as well, that other countries have deregulated. No, they have not done that. They have just interpreted their regulations and have come to the conclusion that based on the definitions, as Brazil and Argentina and Australia and so forth, based on their definitions, that genome editing resulting in small changes, what we call SDN1, does not result under the existing definitions in GMOs or genetically engineered organisms, what they call them. So they're not deregulating, they're just interpreting it. And that's exactly what we hope the Commission will do too, is to give this fine line as this type of changes results in a GMO and these other types does not. Deregulation or exempting will come later on. That's a very different discussion. And I fully agree with anyone who says we regulate on the basis of this novelty, like what has been changed, and deregulating or exempting is on the basis of history of safety. So we should separate those things. Here we're not talking about what we have in the article is not a proposal to change anything actually, but it's just to interpret the rules as they are written and as they would make sense. And there is no, in my view, there is no change of the rules, the existing rules necessary to have a level playing field between Europe and the rest of the world, provided that we interpret the definition in a sensible way and as it is written. And if
hashtag no change of rules necessary, but interpretation, yes.
Right? I'm one of the generation that I don't have Twitter, so I have no idea what it all means. So.
All right, hashtag genome editing. It's just casting the message wider. But so there is then a sense of urgency to a more precise interpretation, so that researchers can get on with their work, right?
Absolutely, and that urgency has been there since 2005 or so. So I'm so happy that it will soon be April, and that the Commission. I was very pleased to hear the Commission explain that their study will address the status on the Union law and will even be broader. That's perfect. That's fine, as long as it addresses this question.
Okay. All right. Let me shift to Jessica. What are the probabilities? This is another question from the audience. What are the probabilities that genome editing would be added as one of the strategies of the farm to fork document, the farm to fork strategy, in creating a more sustainable food production in Europe? Jessica, are you there? Can we shift over to Jessica? There you are. You want me to restate the question? Sorry.
No, I heard you, but I did. I don't think you heard me, but I heard the question.
Okay.
I think it's a good point because I mentioned it earlier from the farm to fork strategy that ask for innovation and more innovative solutions. And as I can see it now, it's more difficult with the current rules. And I think therefore it is important to address these problems that we hear about today, and whether it's interpretation or a realistic problem, and to to ensure that initiatives to the farm to fork will highlight this. And I think that Erik also stressed that quite good, that it has to be clear action and embrace innovation in the future.
Okay, Sirko over at the Commission, you hear me? Are you with us, Sirko? I wanted to ask Sirko the same thing.
I am here. Yeah.
Okay, can I put you on the spot and ask you that too? That should that genome editing be inserted and included into the farm to fork strategy? Because it's the Commission's farm to fork strategy, right?
Correct. In fact, for us, it is included because farm to fork strategy mentions, as Jessica was just saying, it mentions the role of innovative techniques, including biotech. So this is the most you could say about that in this strategy, but it opens up also for the Commission and for others to think what we can do with biotech in the agri-food sector. So I would very much think that there's room for debate for sure. What biotech can do.
All right, good. We got barely 10 minutes left, and I'd like to have a couple of closing comments. So, but send in your questions if you have any others. Question to Dr. Harwood. I call you Wendy. Wendy, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, Doctor, what distinction can be made between research purposes, for example, discovery, genetic diversity, and market applications of genome editing? What distinction should be made between market applications and research purposes? Does that make sense to you?
I'm not quite sure what the questioner had in mind there, but I mean, from my point of view, yes, there is a big distinction between these two things. Genome editing is extensively used as a research tool. I mean, in plant science, but also in many other areas, incredibly important in medicine.
Yeah, that's why it won a Nobel Prize for a French woman and a Californian. Yeah.
Yes, and you know, it's even having a major impact with the current pandemic and these technology being used in different ways to provide tests and things like that. So yeah, so the research area is huge and very important. But obviously that type of research is feeding into, if you like, products for commercialization in different ways. And it may be that the research feeds in, but the final product is not a gene edited product or a GMO product, but it's just the research knowledge that was necessary to produce that product, use the technologies. And in other cases, the technologies may be used directly to give the product. So I don't know if that helps at all, but that's just my way of looking at it.
Okay, that's fine. I got 3 questions left here. Let's see if we can get to them all. Is the gene editing review the end of what needs to be done, or should the EU's GMO regulations be more broadly reviewed? Erik, how about that?
Well, I don't know. It's a sense of being broad. In a way, what Pete is saying is that some interpretation today actually is too broad, and they are not clearly enough defined. So we might even have to be more sharp to allow for more interesting and necessary things.
Okay, let me ask you: should the new Commission study presage new EU legislation on genome editing? How much are you aware of the study, or should we go over to
well, I have a general comment based on research in this, which I think is applicable. First, of course, we have to address the common problems and challenges, which is that we have to be able to use this technique. And if it's just a definition, great, then it can be implemented very quickly. Then we have to realize that things are happening so fast, so we can't really anticipate what legislation will be. But I think we have to be aware of that in our legislation processes and defining processes, so that we are aware and also on our toes when it comes and happen new things that we have to find a framework and rules around. So I think that's the necessary teaching here. We have to anticipate the really, really fast development in this area.
Jessica, any word on that? And let me ask you another one about should there be labeling for plants that have genome editing? Jessica?
No, I think that I forgot the first question, but maybe you can do.
Yeah.
Ask me
No, I
again.
can ask. Okay. Should the new Commission study presage new EU legislation on genome editing? The new Commission study. We don't see it yet, but do you expect new legislation on genome editing?
No, and I think it's interesting what's been said also that there is the interpretation and not the legislation, and that is a way to put it. And I think that was quite interesting perspective on the issue as well. But I think this is, of course, for the Commission to decide and put forward a suggestion. And so I will leave it to that.
Okay. I see Dennis Eriksson asking for the floor. Dennis, are you there?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, Dennis, go ahead.
Thanks. Just before we finish, I just want to...
could you identify yourself again? I'm sorry, I don't have you in my notes.
I'm Dennis Eriksson. I'm a researcher at the Swedish University of Agricultural Science.
Okay, thank you.
Sweden. So I just wanted to chip in one thing before we finish here, returning to the definitions and legal clarity. So what I want to say is that we need to know what is mutagenesis according to the law, because I think that is a point that has been the cause of a lot of confusion since the court ruling into 2018 on mutagenesis. Because we need clarity on mutagenesis. Yes, because what the biologist or what science says about mutagenesis, or the scientific appreciation of mutagenesis as a concept, a phenomena, may be very different from what the law says that the mutagenesis is.
Right, right. And how urgent is it to you that we get more clarity on this, in mind that there are other parts of the world that are advancing with this kind of technology and leaving us behind?
I think it's very urgent. And I would very much like to see some kind of clarification in the Commission study that is going to be presented in April, if possible. So clarity on what mutagenesis is according to the law. Or how this relates to genome editing also, because all these new technologies, we need to know if they result in mutagenesis according to the law, not according to the science, but according to the law. If they result in mutagenesis according to the law or not.
According to the law. Tomasz, can you give us any more enlightenment on that side? We need clarity according to the law.
Well, I can only agree with Dennis as to this aspect, but the only thing I can mention here is that there is a certain clarity that can be provided that most of the researchers won't like, and there is a certain clarity that can be provided that some researchers will like. So the type of clarity where the definition of GMO will be interpreted very broadly is the type of clarity which most of the researchers probably wouldn't want to have. So clarity as such doesn't have any quality. It's only in the details as to what the content of the clarity is.
Okay, what about from a legal standpoint, you being at the Institute of Law Studies at the Polish Academy of Sciences, what about this question about labeling for plants that have been genome edited?
Well, this is actually probably a question to a scientist, but from the academic literature that I have studied on the subject, it seems that there may be practical problems with tracking, monitoring, and as such also labeling these products, because they differ from the, so to say, classical GMOs in the sense that they have minute changes which could also have appeared naturally, which means that there is a very little, there are very little possibilities to prove that the product, which is, let's say, unlabeled, whereas it should, that it actually is the regulated product. Because if the current, I would say, predominant interpretation of the judgment is going to be upheld, then you could end up with this essentially the same product one of which is not going to be regulated and as such labeled, and another one which will be regulated only depending on the method of its procurement, whether it was whether the product was procured through conventional methods or through gene editing. So when it comes to labeling, well, it carries a certain stigmatization. Of course, this is one aspect that has to be added to this equation.
Right, to some, yeah, right.
But the other thing is that there might be serious practical problems when it comes to actually determining that some product was mislabeled or not labeled, whereas it should, and so on. But this is probably a question to...
Okay, then let's ask one of the researchers. Yeah, let's, Wendy, what do you think? What about labeling?
So yeah, Thomas is right that the many of the plants that we're talking about will have just a small change in the DNA, you know, maybe just a single letter of the DNA code. And if you don't know that that change has been made, then you would have real problems detecting it. So there is this issue of how do you regulate something if you can't detect it. But then on the other hand, if full information is provided on the change that's been made, then we have very efficient ways of picking that up and looking for it and seeing if in fact it is the edited line. So I think it's, yeah, I mean, I can't really make much comment on labeling at this stage, but just to comment on the science of the, what is practical, what can we detect and what can't we detect at the moment.
What should we be communicating to the consumer about this?
Yeah. Well, I think, as part of the consultation that we've got going on at the moment, I mean, the views of the consumers are really important, and a consumer choice is always important. So that absolutely must be factored in on these decisions about labeling.
Pete, are you still with us, or are you busy scribbling away there?
I am.
I know you have a project. Now, the consumer and labeling, what do you think about that? Labeling for genome editing.
Actually, I wanted to react to that because that's the other thing we should avoid, this very blanket type of discussion. Should we have labeling for genome editing? No, some genome edited organisms are GMOs and therefore need to be labeled. Others do. Other application of genome editing does not result in a GMO. For example, if you just delete one base pair, and they do not need to be labeled. So here again, make a distinction between what is the rule at the moment and whether that will be desirable or not. But I think this whole discussion, if you talk in very general terms about do we need to label for genome editing, it's not very useful. So bear in mind, as in most other countries is the case, some applications of genome editing result in GMOs and others do not. And I'd like to add one more thing, because there's always reference to foreign DNA. I actually can envisage that cases whereby you do not introduce foreign DNA, but you make a multiple string of very small changes. So there's a combination of a lot of small changes in a very targeted way. That might be something that is a GMO, because it is, although no foreign DNA is introduced, something that is very unlikely to happen in nature. But you bring it all back to the definition of Article 2, something that is not likely to happen in nature or natural, whatever the phrasing is. Yeah, so let us steer away from this very blanket type of discussion, because it doesn't really help. And one last point, and then I have to bury myself again in my document about changing the law. Having done that since 1986, I have been very much a part of developing the EU directives in this field and then revising them again 10 years later. It is a very lengthy process and a very difficult process. At the time, it was not so difficult. I believe that if we were to start now to open the rules, to change them in whatever direction, I can tell you two things. It will be very, very long process. It will be with a very uncertain outcome, because halfway the process, everything else can be inserted. And thirdly, and I think that's even the worst one, it will be even more polarizing, this whole debate about changing the rules. So I can only hope that if we just all carefully look at the GMO definition, we look at them, we look at what's happening in nature, and there are some very good publications around as to what is happening in nature. And let's face it, today we know that far more is happening in nature than we ever thought possible 20, 30 years ago. We now know that the sequences of a bacterium has been for thousands of years inserted in plants, in sweet potatoes. So all of that should be looked at together, and I trust the Commission will be doing that.
Yeah.
And I believe that with a sensible interpretation, or just actually no, a legal correct interpretation of the law, we can gain much more than this whole banging on changing rules, because it will lead to misery.
Right. Oh, that's good. You got a lot of good headlines there, Pete. Yeah,
Oh, no.
hashtag genome editing. You're throwing down the gauntlet over there to the Commission. Sirku, are you still with us? Sirku Heinema, DG Santé, Head of Unit for GMO.
I am still with you, yes.
Now, you're in the hot seat there, because you're facing off with avid people who would like to do more genome editing to increase food production, and then there's of course a very strong side in Europe that it is against any GMO or genome editing. What is the next step for you? And let me ask you that one about labeling. Labeling, should we label genome edited organisms?
I cannot answer to that question to you now. I mean, if that would be I want to say it differently. We in the EU, we are very much for the consumers' rights and information for the consumers and for the transparency. So whatever policy action there may be taken after the study is out, as you know, that was also what the Council was asking. Once the study is out, please consider Commission what should be done next. I would see it very difficult for EU to do anything which would not adhere to this very important principle of transparency.
Okay, let me go to Erik for some final comments. Erik, the importance in keeping the research going in Europe and financing it in the EU, that's important to you being on the research committee, Erik. Are you there?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
and it is of great importance. Yeah, it is, and in this case, it's really great important, because what Emmanuel Charpentier and Jenny Doda did, and sometimes words are degraded because we use them too much. I would say it's a true revolution. It's a game changer, and this is what will signify research when it comes to food production, both vegetables and livestock. And if our researcher can't do that in Europe, they can do it, of course, with people outside, but we can do that, then we will lose competence and we will lose competitiveness in these cases. And I think it's absolutely essential that we can do this in a reasonable way, because so large part of the rest of the world is actually doing this right now. So it's not a matter of if, it's just a matter of when. And the longer we wait, in a way, the more we will become after the rest of the world in this, when it comes to research, but also when it comes to food production. And meaning either we have to increase the amounts we put in the cap enormously, or we have to just face the fact that it's much more efficient for us to import all the food we need. But of course, that can't be an outcome of this. So I would say, and I would like to thank the organizers, the EP office in Stockholm, and to you, Chris, and the panelists, because I would think this has been a very informative day, and it has given me at least hope that we will make great progress when it comes to this. And as you understand, I think it's absolutely necessary that we do it, because food it's not just any commodity. It's actually what we need to live every day, and that we cannot be as efficient and in the front as the rest of the world. That's really not an option. So I'm hopeful now for the report, and I'm really hopeful because when I talk to Jessica, my co-host today, and others in the European Parliament, this is nothing that is to block politics. Actually, we're quite a lot of people who think that this is absolutely necessary for us to be part of this really necessary development.
Chris, we cannot hear you.
Chris, can you hear us? We can't hear you.
Chris, we can't hear you.
Chris, we can't hear you. We see you, but I don't know if you're muted.
His mic is not muted, but it doesn't work.
Connect me again, Jessica. Let me know when you hear me. Are we connected again?
Now.
Okay, that's great. Okay, final comment from you. What are the next steps, Jessica, in this process?
Yeah, I will just start by thanking all the panelists, and there has been a very interesting day, and thank you for joining in. Also, we had over 500 participants joining in yesterday, so that was very good to see. I would say that it is not an obligation, but I think it's important for politicians as well to also try to be a part of the enlightening and to focus on these issues that maybe are a bit hidden in the daily work in the Parliament. But I think it's a great challenge, and I think that this is a way to be focusing on the innovation, and like someone said, that not to lose the EU competitiveness, but also to be available and to make this a good possibility in the farm to fork strategy, for example, to embrace innovation and to go forward in that.
And I think, isn't this part of the transparency that we were talking about throughout this event, that there has to be transparency that the consumer, I as a European consumer, want to know about this. And the more transparency there is, I think perhaps the less people are going to say, well, I don't understand that, so I'm opposed to it. If there's more transparency, perhaps there's a bit more understanding about what needs to be done. Right, Jessica?
Yeah, I think you're perfectly right. And I think I don't have the answer for what you asked earlier on labeling, for example, but I also think it's important that consumers know how to interpret the labeling. And therefore, I think discussion and information is crucial for the consumers within the EU, because if you don't, if you can't read the label correctly, then maybe we shouldn't have them. But I think that is a discussion that we can have forward.
Jessica Polfjärd and Erik Bergkvist and all the speakers, thank you very much. I'm Chris Burns. See you next time.